All right. We have the thumbs up. It's so good to see you all tonight again. Thank you so much for coming back, even though you knew I was going to be here. I really appreciate that. And I hope that the controversy that I stirred up last week was not too much to keep you I hope you came ready for bear, ready for war to take me down. But I appreciate very much so that you guys have come back and given me the opportunity to speak again into this important issue. Before we get started, though, just a couple of quick notes on the next couple of weeks. Next week is our Guns N' Roses event here at the church. So if you are under the age of 18, you are welcome to Guns N' Roses. If you are over the age of 18 but just want to shoot some teenagers with Nerf guns, you're welcome as well. We also have, so that's going to be here on the church campus. Elsewhere at, what's the name of it? Red Rock Barn? Is that right? Red Rock Barn. We are going to have a more adult kind of event where there will be some dancing and good food and all kinds of the fun. So if that is more your style, you are welcome to join us for that. What we do ask, however, is that if you could sign up, there are some paper sign-ups floating around or maybe in the back there. You can either do it on the paper copy or you may do it on Faith Life. There's a form. You do not have to do it on both places, however. Sound good? Got it? Good. Okay, so join us next week at somewhere, wherever you want to be, whichever sounds more fun to you. It's here. Whichever sounds more fun to you, you may join in those festivities, but please sign up so we know how much food to bring, how many Nerf bullets that we need to get. All of those things are helpful for us. So that's next week. The week following that, the 21st, I believe, right, or the 7th, yes, we are going to have our fine arts night here in the sanctuary. And so our youth are going to be presenting the things that they have been working hard on and sharing with you those things that God has blessed them and put in their hearts. So we encourage you, please be here. Don't take that as a week that we can just the youth are doing it. We can peace out. That is one of the most important weeks, I think, that we as adults can be here to show our teenagers the wonderful thing that God has put inside of them and to celebrate them and enjoy what they have done. So that's the next couple of weeks, and then the following week, Pastor Phil will be back and sharing with you back to regularly scheduled programming. So Pastor Phil tonight is out at district meetings, so please pray for him as he's in the midst of it with all the pastors and district leaders. It's good things, really it is. But he tapped on me to pinch hit for him again tonight, so I appreciate the opportunity. Last week, we jumped into this topic of the book of Exodus from more of a historical and textual point of view. So last week, we talked primarily about the textual side of things. So no matter what any scholar might say, no matter what any of your friends might say, we read at the very beginning last week a couple of quotes about how fantastical the stories of the Exodus are. No matter what anyone might say about how there's no way that this ever could have happened, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt from its foundation that the people of Israel believed this story was true. Okay? That's the number one thing I wanted you to get from last week. That no matter what anybody says, no matter what any evidence is presented, we're going to look at many different theories of the Exodus and the route through Sinai and those things today. But no matter what any of that says, at its foundational core, God wanted and the people of Israel understood this was the genesis of them as a people. This event was the moment that they pointed to. How many of you are comfortable with the idea that Jesus tells parables in the New Testament? Is it okay for Jesus to tell stories? It's okay for Jesus to tell stories, right? Okay, we're going to start off with our first controversial moment of the night. Are you ready for it? If you want to come up and argue with me or hit me in the face, you're welcome to do that afterwards. Not right now, but you can ruminate on this for a moment. I'll tell you, I am comfortable with things like the book of Jonah, the book of Job. I'm okay if those happen to be parables or historical fiction. These things that have this fantastical element. I see some of you back there saying, "Ooh, boy," okay? These stories that have this fantastical element to them that we might look at and be like, boy, that doesn't seem like that's possible in reality. And the reason I'm okay with those types of books, those types of things being more just stories, is that there's no like salvation element to them. There's nothing historical about them that says, if this isn't true, my faith is shook, okay? Now, we all have watched, and we gave the example of Iron Man last week, right? If Iron Man were to be, the movie Iron Man were to be discovered 2,000 years from now, and somebody watched this, it looks real, it sounds real, this is the type of way that people talked, like, was Iron Man a real historical figure? So for us who live in the age of Iron Man, and we went to the theaters and watched Iron Man, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is not a true story. Now, the movie makers went to great lengths to make it seem plausible. Like there's nothing really superhero-y about Iron Man. It's just a really smart guy who put things together and was able to make a suit that made him into this superhero. But there's nothing that really defies the laws of physics. Or, stretch your imagination a little bit. It's okay. But we know that the genre of movie that we're watching when we go watch a superhero movie is, okay, we got to stretch the bands of reality a little bit. And we're okay with that, right? Because it tells us a story, helps us understand a little bit about humanity. It's funny. It's all of these kinds of things. And we walk out of there like, well, that was fun. Hopefully, we walk out of a movie and enjoy ourselves, right? And we can be like, yeah, I'd see that again sometime. Maybe on Netflix once it comes out. I'm not paying for it again, you know? But we understand the genre of movie that Iron Man is. Now, I would submit that anybody in the ancient world who read the book of Job or Jonah or Exodus knew exactly what was intended by that kind of literature. There were cues just embedded in that text that they go, I know what kind of a book Job is. It's telling me an important story that may or may not be true. There are some weird elements in it. Do people really talk in poetry in the ancient world? No, maybe that's a cue for me to understand, like, it could have happened, but it didn't have to happen the way that Job outlines it or the way that Jonah outlines it. Nothing about my faith is absolutely dependent on this being a legitimate event that happened in history. Now, change the side of the coin and look at the book of Exodus. Exodus, every single thing, every time that Exodus is referenced, every time even Jesus looks at Exodus, every time they're looking at it, not from like well, that was a nice story that taught me an important lesson. They're looking at it and saying, that event happened. That event was the source of our salvation. That event defined who we are as a people. That's not an event that we can just like make up out of the ether and be like, yeah, that sounds like a good origin story like we talked about last week, okay? Are you comfortable with that? You don't have to agree with me about Job and Jonah, but I would suggest that you almost do have to agree with me about the book of Exodus, okay? So no matter what you hear me say or how angry you get when I say this is right or that's wrong, remember this story, as Christians, we believe this happened. We believe this tells the story of God saving his people. This is the story that began a people on a course with God. devoted to him only, following his laws, his decrees. The entire story of the history of Israel is defined by this moment, both good and bad. When Israel breaks from its covenant and they get exiled from the land, they can point back to this moment at Sinai to say that is why we got expelled from the land, because we did not uphold our end of the agreement, of the covenant that we made with them. Sound good? So as we go forward, keep that in mind, that we are looking not at an event of fantasy, not at an event that is just pulled out of thin air, but this is an event that is grounded in history, that even though, as we've said last week, even though we can't point to any external evidence that says 100%, yes, it happened in the way that the Bible tells it, there is none. But we're not going to allow ourselves to go like, because of that fact. Because there are plenty of things that we'll talk about that can help us take this event and say, that's plausible within history. And because of its plausibility and the fact that Israel centers itself on this event more than any other, we can take this event and say, yeah, that happened in the way that the Bible told it, okay? Now, Moses or whoever wrote the book of Exodus, is it possible that he took some theological creative liberties? Absolutely. And that's not outside of the bounds of the way that he was writing. And it doesn't mean that he's writing to deceive or that he's writing in such a way to make us confused or anything. At one point, he uses the name Horeb for the mountain of God. At another place, like a few verses later, he uses the name Sinai. Why did he do that? Was he just trying to confuse us? No, he's writing with a theological bent in mind and with an understanding of the location, and the places in history. And everybody who read this book for the first time, they knew what he was talking about. They understood why he might say Horeb here and Sinai here. But many of those kinds of things have just been lost to us. And we don't understand why he did those things. We don't understand what the purpose was. But Moses had an understanding. He was able to edit his own work, right? So he's not going to put Horeb and then Sinai just to be like, we'll throw him off the scent. He did it on purpose, and he could have gone back and fixed it if he really wanted to, but he decided not to. It wasn't necessary for him. It wasn't confusing for the people who were reading it in that first moment. For us, there are things that are confusing. There are things that we can't locate geographically, historically. He doesn't name the Pharaoh. Oh, how we wish Moses had named, who is this Pharaoh? Oh, that would clear up so many things for us to just be able to say, maybe it's that, maybe it's that, maybe it's that, maybe it's that. No, it's here in history. And we go, okay, this falls in line. That works. This is what's happening around the world at that time. But he doesn't do that because he wants us to see this, not just that Pharaoh is a meanie. He wants us to see this is how God responds to evil and oppression in the world. Not just at that one point in history, but this is what God does in history whenever he confronts evil and oppression. Okay? So we understand, yes, that's how God worked at that moment. But we talked last week about how over and over the people of Israel, and even us as Christians, God invites us into the story, right? To tell this story over and over and over and over and over and over again. We're going to celebrate Passover and Easter with a Seder, and we're going to tell this story. And that has been done for 2,000 years, 2,500 years, 30,000 years, 3,500 years potentially. That's how long this retelling has been done. And the intention is to bring us right in the middle of this story and not say, look what God did with Pharaoh Ramses, but to say, look what God does in these kinds of situations. Look how God saves his people and brings them out. So That's the foundation for where we're at tonight. You good with that? Again, if you want to come fight me later, that's okay with me. But in order to, we do want to step kind of into that historical and the geographical realm and see if we can discern what are some things that we maybe can figure out, based on what we know from history, what we know of geography, what we know looking way back. There are some things that we can kind of pinpoint, or at least throw a couple darts and say it's probably one of these kind of three things. So with that said, so Where in the Wilderness is the Mountain of God is the title for tonight. Anybody recognize the reference? Say it loud. There we go. That's what I was going for, and it flopped miserably. But Meg, could you put the click on here? There we go. So I showed you this at the very end last time. And so typically, at least when I think of Egypt, I won't put it on y'all, but when I think of Egypt, we think very flat in Egypt. Like all of Egypt is the same Egypt. The same people who are building the pyramids are the same people who are oppressing the Israelites. But that's just not the case. So the pyramids we looked at last week were built during that period of the Old Kingdom in the purple on the top there. Probably sometime 2500 BC, maybe even up to 3000 BC. I even saw one thing that said it could be as late as, or as early as like 6000 BC. I don't know if I'll go that far, but the pyramids themselves are very, very, very old. The Israelites were not building pyramids, you guys, okay? So don't fall into that trap. After the Old Kingdom, there was an intermediate period where centralized government in Egypt kind of fell to the wayside. That first intermediate period then became another kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, where there was another period of pharaohs. This Middle Kingdom is likely the time of Abraham, and even possibly, depending on when we date the Exodus, possibly around the time towards the end of it that Joseph headed down into Egypt. We have this second intermediate period followed by the period of the Hyksos. Can you say Hyksos? How many of you ever heard of the Hyksos before? Okay, a few of us. So the Hyksos are not Egyptians, but they acted like Egyptians. They are Semitic people. So Semitic people means people from Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine type area who moved down into Egypt during this time, and they set up shop. They decided, we would like to rule Egypt because Egypt has some pretty great things. Now, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, all of those areas is prone to famine, right? This is the story of Joseph, that Joseph is down there in Egypt during the time of deep famine in all of the land, but there's one area of that region in the world that survives through the famine. And part of it is because of Joseph's great leadership, but another part of it is Egypt just has an easier set of natural resources to be able to sustain themselves through this kind of time. Now, they went through famine, certainly, but their famine did not typically look like famine that we would see more up along the coast of the Mediterranean. So Egypt was much more able to sustain themselves through this period. And so we have, during the Middle Kingdom and even into the Older Kingdom, we have Egyptian records where they make note of these Asiatics, these people who are coming from that region, Israel, Palestine, and even further beyond. They are coming down into Egypt because they recognize we have no water up here, and we need to move down into where there is some water for our flocks and herds and just for our family to be able to survive. And the Egyptian people were pretty angry with these Asiatics. There's a couple of quotations that are read that are just like, these fools thinking they can come into our land and just use up our resources. But ultimately, oftentimes they let them come in. Now they might end up like the family of Joseph, where there's like, yeah, we'll live with them for a little bit, But then if they become too numerous or they start to be threatening, then we need to enslave them. Now, there's some thought that because these Hyksos people came from this region in Israel, Palestine, and beyond, that this might have been a time where it was natural for Joseph and his family to head down into the land of Egypt. Natural for someone who is Semitic like Joseph to rise to a position of prominence within Egypt. Can you understand why that would be easier for him during this period as opposed to a period of strong centralized Egyptian rule where Joseph, the Hyksos rulers still called themselves pharaohs. We have the dynasties within Egypt. And scholars recognize that I think the 13th, 14th, and 15th dynasties within Egypt are all Hyksos dynasties, okay? So they kind of folded themselves into Egyptian history and Egyptian culture, but they still retained some of their Semitic roots, okay? Are you tracking with me so far? So Joseph very possibly came down into Egypt during this period of the Hyksos reign, which was about 1780 to 1570 BC. And it's right on the heels of the second intermediate period. So there's this Semitic people who ruled in Egypt for about 200 years. They centralized their rule up in the Nile Delta region. So in the Nile Delta, you have your maps. This one right here is a satellite image of the region of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. And you can very easily tell the delta of the Nile because it just fans out and there is all kinds of water available for everyone, it feels like, right? So, but we also know that the people of Egypt actually lived all along the Nile. They didn't stray too far from the Nile, but at sometimes in Egypt's history, the Delta region was kind of the center hub of commerce and government and all of those things. But at other times in its history, the capital city might move further south, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But during this time of the Hyksos, the people and the government centered in this Nile Delta region. Now, if you look on that satellite map, you see the name Goshen. See Goshen on there? Let's see, I'll pull that map up. Can you give me that? There we go. So Goshen is right in here. So this is the region that the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, occupied. And it's well accepted that if there were Israelite or Hebrew people in the land of Egypt, which we as Christians were accepting that that is true, that this is where they lived. There is a remnant of Semitic people who lived in this region. We see it from pottery. The pottery of the Semitic people looks different than the pottery of the Egyptian people. We see it from burial practices are different than Egyptian burial practices. So there is direct evidence, especially during this Hyksos period, that there is a Semitic people that lives in this region of the Nile Delta. And very likely that includes the Hebrews, right? So during this period of Joseph and the patriarchs of Egypt, as we're heading towards the time of Moses, there is evidence of a Semitic people in the land of Egypt who set up shop there, who had their own region that the Egyptian people did not really encumber upon, okay? So even though we might say there is no direct evidence that the Exodus actually happened, we do have evidence of a Semitic people who lived in this region around the right time period, okay? So that's mark number one of why this is plausible that the Exodus event could have happened. Now, definitely that Semitic people included the Hyksos, okay? So we can't just say it's definitely 100% the Hebrew people, but we at least have an era of plausibility that this could have happened during this time frame. So if you will take a look at this chart, you have two charts on back-to-back pages. So this is the chart of the 18th and 19th dynasty of the Egyptian kings in the New Kingdom. So again, the new kingdom is this time period from about 1570 BC and later than that, or closer to us, okay, in time frame. So King Ahmose is the first king of the 18th dynasty, and he gathers up a group of rebel Egyptians and expels the Hyksos from Egypt, okay? He sends them out of the land and chases them up into the region that we know as Israel. We have documentation from Egyptian sources that says chase them at least as far as like the Gaza Strip type area, okay? So that's going to be important a little bit later. But he chases them out, and we have all kinds of evidence of destruction throughout Israel during this time period. So we have evidence of archaeological layers where at this point in history, there's evidence of destruction in the Canaanite cities in the land of Israel, okay? So Ahmose is the first king or pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and following Ahmose, we have this period where Egypt is angry with Canaan and Palestine, okay? So they are consistently campaigning up and down the Mediterranean coast, trying to keep probably the Hyksos at bay, saying, you are not allowed back into our land. During this time, scroll down with your finger and find Thutmose III and then Amenhotep II. Okay? These two pharaohs, we have direct evidence in their annals of history that they specifically targeted the land of Canaan and brought back slaves from Canaan. They record at least up to like 90,000 slaves that they brought from Canaan down into the land of Egypt. So it's possible that some of those Semitic people who live in the region of Goshen are some of these Canaanites. Maybe some of them are Hebrews, but at least they have brought some slaves down from Canaan to live and work and be in the land of Egypt. Now, following Amenhotep, go down to the second Amenhotep IV, okay? So, I'm sorry, it's a little confusing because we have 4 Amenhoteps, but we're going number 4. And this pharaoh called himself, rather than Amenhotep, he called himself Akhenaten. You say Akhenaten? So Akhenaten was one of, if not our first and only example of a king in this entire region who worshiped in a monotheistic way. Okay? Now, he didn't worship Yahweh. That would not be right for him. But we know the Egyptians, they had a pantheon of gods, right? They have all kinds of gods. You've seen them in all kinds of depictions throughout popular media and even shows and various things. But Akhenaten was a revolutionary in the ancient world. Never before had an entire group of people or a leader of a group of people said, we are going to worship one God and one God only. So what did that make Akhenaten? Was he popular? Right? In fact, he was called a heretic. Now, we, as 21st century Christians, think monotheism, and we're like, that's the right way to worship. That's orthodoxy. But no, when you worship a pantheon of gods, and all of a sudden someone says, no, we only worship one God, he becomes a heretic. And anything bad that happens in the land is because of the heretic God, who angered the other pantheon of gods and said, no, we're only worshiping one God. So you see at the end of Akhenaten's name, we see the term Aten, okay? So Akhenaten was worshiping the god Aten. Now, primarily, so Aten is a sun god, and his symbol is a sun disk. Do you know of another Egyptian god that is a sun god? Ra, right? And Ra is like almost chief, if not the chief among the pantheon, but depending on when in Egyptian history we're looking. And so Akhenaten says, we're worshiping one God, the sun god, but not the sun god that you're used to worshiping. We're worshiping this other sun god, Akhenaten, or we're worshiping Aten. And I, Akhenaten, am his son. Naturally, right? The pharaohs were very proud of themselves and were very happy to display themselves as a god. And so while Akhenaten might have been a revolutionary and monotheistic, sort of, he really still propped himself up as a god. He was a heretic who said, worship Aten, but I am his son, and I am the one who is responsible for doling out Aten's desires here in the world. I am the one who's responsible for the peace of the world, basically. I'm the one who's responsible for bringing, we understand the Hebrew idea of shalom, right? This like everything is as it should be. The Egyptians had a similar idea, and it's called Ma'at. Okay, Ma'at was like the ideal Egyptian society was Ma'at. Everything is as it should be. There is no strife. There's no chaos. Everything just works as it is. And the king, the Pharaoh, is the one who's responsible for bringing that about. So when everything is working as it should, Pharaoh is the one who is worshipped, okay? Now, following Akhenaten, we see Smenkhare. Okay, I don't know who that boy is. He's only there for about 3 years. But then who do we see directly following Amenhotep, or Akhenaten, sorry? King Tut. We all know King Tut. And King Tut was like not all that important, I'm sorry to tell you. He was not super important. He didn't exist as a king for very long, and he actually was probably the one who was responsible for the downfall of the kingdom, unfortunately, because very soon thereafter we see the beginning of the 19th dynasty, right? So if you are towards the end of the king lists on one dynasty, you see the name Horemhab right there. Horemhab was King Tut's military general. So what do you think happened here? We have a coup, most likely, that happened. And Horemhab said, like, this is pretty useful. There's this one king, Ai, who lasts for a couple of years, and he was just like, we'll let him do it because maybe he's next in line. But King Tut doesn't have any sons of his own, and so Horemhab becomes the king who is essentially responsible for shifting the course and moving into a new dynasty. So King Tut, you see Tutankhamun is King Tut's like full name, right? Nobody knows how to say it, so that's why he's just King Tut. But he's Tutankhamun. His first actual name was Tutankhaten. What do we hear at the end of that? Aten. So he's following in his father's footsteps, Akhenaten's footsteps, saying, we worship Aten. But actually, nobody really liked that, and I need to see if I can sustain my reign as long as humanly possible. So we are going to change my name to son of Amun, not Aten anymore. Amun-Ra is where Amun comes from. So he returns worship to the sun god Ra, and also the pantheon of gods. Following with me so far? So this is just Egyptian history, and what we're eventually going to do is try to say, like, okay, where might Israel fit in here? We mentioned that Israel likely came into the land of Egypt before all of these kings, before Akhmos in 1570, maybe during the time of the Hyksos, but definitely before all of these kings. And so we have two kind of time periods that we look at to say that's likely a possibility for when the Exodus actually could have happened. So we mentioned these two pharaohs, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. from the year 1504 to 1425. And so the first possibility for Exodus is somewhere around the year 1446 during the reign of one of these two pharaohs. So we mentioned that these pharaohs are venturing into the land of Canaan very frequently and talking about how they have brought slaves out of Canaan back down into Egypt. They were very fierce kings or pharaohs. So these are two of the possibilities. And then the third most prominent possibility is we're going to jump down 200 years into the 19th dynasty, and Ramses II is the next pharaoh that we're going to take a look at. So during the 19th dynasty, we have an entirely different set of kings, as we saw. So if we look at this slide right here, so we see Did I do that? There we go. Way down here at the bottom, we see Thebes, okay? So this temple right here is the temple of Thebes, and this city is, we're jumping here, is the capital city for most of the 18th dynasty. So you see how far south that is along the Nile, way down there. I think Pastor Phil might have shown this picture right here of slaves who are building bricks and then constructing a ramp up towards like what might be a pyramid. What they're actually constructing is this guy right here, okay? So we know that there are slaves that are working down this far, but where do we know that the Israelites and the Hebrew people settled in? They're much further north in the region of Goshen, which this Tel Ed Daba, or Avaris, or Ramses. So if you read Exodus 1:11, there are the cities of Ramses and Pitom, right? That's way up here. So this is one of the issues that we might have with an earlier date of the Exodus, because we know that the capital cities or city of all of these pharaohs are way down here in Thebes. And we have these reports of Moses like going and talking to Pharaoh, and then it feels like in the same day he's returning and talking to the Israelites, going and talking to Pharaoh, and then right back to the Israelite or the Hebrew people, going and talking. So this is one of the issues that we have with this early date of Exodus around the year 1440. Akhenaten, the heretic king, established his capital city a little bit further north here at this site that's today called El Amarna. He actually named the city after himself and called it Akhenaten, as you do, right? So from El Amarna, we have an amazing library of documents, of stone tablets that have surfaced that we've discovered that are primarily correspondences between the land of Canaan up here and the king down here. And it's all of these little city-states in the land of Canaan who are trying to pump themselves up and show like how worthy we are of being your subsidiary, how worthy we are, Akhenaten, of your support, how worthy we are of you providing the things that we need. We follow everything after what you have done. Aten, oh yeah, we love Aten, right? Okay, so we have all of these fascinating documents, and many of the ways that we understand the relationship between Egypt and Canaan happens from this time of the heretic king, as we see these documents at El Amarna here. So that's from the time of right around the year 1400, a little bit or closer to us than that. We also have an example of, this is Ramses II up here on his chariot, fighting and going out into war, and you see the people who are meeting their demise at his. So this is an example of the type of warfare that we see in the book of Exodus is legitimate for what is happening at this time. You have a question, Troy? Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is a very good question, and you have hit on one of the key issues. What he's talking about is you can also flip your page over, and this gives you kind of a broad outline of the two views of the Exodus, two primary views of the Exodus. One being that it happened around the year 1446, and two being that it happened about 200 years later around the year 1250. So if you would turn in your Bibles with me to 1 Kings chapter 6. All right, 1 Kings chapter 6. Anyone want to read it for me? Sorry, just verse 1. But if you want the whole thing, I mean. Okay, so we're fast forwarding 480 years into the reign of Solomon, and this is where the problem lies, okay? So let me read to you a little bit of an excerpt because it might be confusing to think about how do we know, like 3,000 years ago, how can we be so accurate with dates to know like this is when this king or this pharaoh ruled, or this is when what year was the fourth year of Solomon. So we have a fairly accurate estimation of when was the fourth year of Solomon. So let me read this to you and you'll get a sense for how we arrive at those dates. So it doesn't happen because of anything we know about Egypt. It doesn't happen because of anything we know about Israel. Here's where it comes from. We begin by turning our attention. So this is from the book How to Read Exodus. I would highly recommend this book if you're interested in the book of Exodus. Tremper Longman is an excellent Old Testament scholar. He also has a book, How to Read Proverbs, How to Read Psalms, and How to Read Genesis, I think are the 4 books that he has, and they are wonderful, giving you some of the types of things that I'm giving you here tonight. So he says, we begin by turning our attention to chronological texts, not from Egypt, not from Israel, but from Assyria, so way far away out in Assyria. The most important of which is the Assyrian Eponym Canon, or AEC as it's called. It's a dating system that covers the year 910 to 612 BC. The Eponym Canon does not provide absolute dates on the surface, meaning it doesn't just say like, this happened in the year 650 BC. But it lists years by the names of a limu, which is an important official, or a king or an associates, and he associates that year with a significant event that occurred during that same year. So a king rises to power, and they say, this king rose to power in the same year that X happened, okay? These events include statements about war, about flooding, or even astronomical phenomena, including eclipses. Since eclipses occur at regular and predictable times, astronomers today can calculate when they occurred way back in antiquity in Assyria. And thus, they can provide an absolute date for the rise of that king to power. So you tracking with that? So they say, the Assyrian annals say, this king rose to power in the same year that we had this wild eclipse. Now, modern astronomers go, that wild eclipse, I can calculate when that wild eclipse happened way back in antiquity. An eclipse of the sun is mentioned during the eponymate of Bagzil of Guzan. This event can be dated definitively to 763 BC. So this provides a center from which other relative dates can be determined. By the use of this text in comparison with other Assyrian historical texts that mention Israel, there's a black obelisk that mentions the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, and he makes Jehu pay tribute, Jehu, the king of Israel, pay tribute to Assyria. Scholars can then assign an absolute date to certain biblical events. Once some biblical events are dated this way, the relative dates can be converted into absolute dates. So without going into all the details, the proceeding in this fashion, it's possible to situate the 4th year of Solomon to 966 BC, give or take a few years. So, tracking with me? This is very convoluted, you guys, and that's part of why I'm reading this to you. So you get a sense of like, we're stretching a little bit, but it's the best that we can do. But if we then add 480 years to 966, according to 1 Kings 6:1, what do we come up with? 1446. That's where that date came from. So the Annals of the Kings specifically says 480 years from 966, that's when this happened. But as we're looking at this list of kings and we're looking at this map and we're saying, but the capital city was in Thebes. And just like you said, Troy, there is no Ramses until, what year? 1320. And we also actually know that the city of Ramses was not actually built until Ramses II. So that's the year 1304. So we have at least about 150 years where the Israelite people are in Egypt building the city of Ramses, but according to 1 Kings 6:1, we're saying there was no Ramses to build. So what is happening here? Question? Tracking with it? Yep. Say that again, I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. The Israelites, you're saying? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a good point that you make. And it's as we're looking far back, we're like, do they have the same length of year as we have? That's a legitimate question. Do they mean the same thing by year that we mean by year? Or we talked last week even about some of the ways that Israel uses, or the Hebrew authors use numbers in a way that is different from how we use numbers. So, any math whizzes in the building? 480, what is that divisible by? Any wild guesses or quick thoughts? 6, 8, 12, 4, all kinds of numbers, right? Okay, and were any of those significant numbers? 12 is a highly, highly, highly significant number in the Bible, and a number that the biblical authors do all kinds of funny things with, okay? So 12 times what equals 480? If you need to get your calculator or your toes out, you're welcome to. 40. Is 40 a number that you've heard in the Bible sometime? Oh, certainly it is, right? The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. Like, this is a significant number. In fact, in other places, we recognize that the number 40 is kind of a round number that we in the Old Testament use for a generation. Okay? 40 equals a generation is just kind of an assumed thing in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. So if we take 12 times 40, we have 12 generations. So, I mean, like, we have the same number of the children or of the tribes of Israel, that many generations after the Exodus is when Solomon is starting to build his temple. Like, guys, anything could happen with this number, but it should be, our alarm bells should be going off to say, like, it might not be an exact number like we want it to be. Our modern mathematical mind says 480 is 480. But what I'm telling you is it's quite possible, maybe even probable, that the writer of 1 Kings is not counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, shoot, I miscounted. Let me go back and look at the list of kings again. No, he's saying it was about 12 generations of people. Now, do you know the average age that Hebrew people had children? Me neither. Was it 40? Probably not, right? What could it have been? 22, 25, somewhere in that ballpark. If we move that number down to 25, what is 12 times 25? 300. That's if 12 is the actual number and not just the symbolic number. If we move it down to 12 times 25 is 300 years, just as a ballpark figure, where does that bring us to if we take 966 and add 300 years? We're in 1266, and who is the Pharaoh at 1266? Ramses the second. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, so this is where we get our second theory of the timing of the Exodus. Is it might feel like it should be a concrete number, 480 years after 966, but really the biblical authors quite possibly, maybe even probably, were saying it was about 12 generations, and that's going to put us right smack dab in a ballpark figure that works better with what's going on in Egypt. Because all of a sudden, here's what Ramses does, is he says, we're not having a capital at Thebes, we're not having a capital at El Amarna, we're going to move the capital city way back up here to Avaris. Avaris was the capital of the Hyksos reign. And Ramses says, we're going to build right on top of those darn Hyksos people, and we're going to make ourselves a new capital. And guess who's going to get to build it for us? The Semitic people. So you're building a monument to me on top of where your people loosely used to live and rule and reign. That's a statement in and of itself, is it not? Ramses is known as the great builder of this 19th dynasty, and he was, if he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus story, we know he is ruthless, right? We know that he thinks very little and does not care who he hurts in his warpath, right? So Ramses moves his capital up to Avaris and renames the city Ramses, okay? This today is connected to this Tel El Daba, which is the name of the archaeological site. So if you're Googling this, trying to find what remnants do we have of what's going on, Tel El Daba is the site that you would want. There's also another name not on here called Qantir, Qantir, if that interests you as well. But just moving the date of the Exodus forward a couple hundred years does not fix everything, okay? It is, we want to take the Bible at its word, right? That if it says 480 years, we should at least say, well, what would that do? If we take it at its word and say it's 480 years, I'll be honest, it's easier to account for the period of the Judges if we take the earlier date of Exodus, okay? So if you look on the back of this page, and let's see, it's that one. So you can see what happens to the period of the Judges if we have to move the date of the Exodus closer to 1250. The Judges have to happen in this extremely short period of time. Now, there are dates associated, or years associated with the Judges, and if you add up all those years without accounting for any kind of overlap between the Judges, we end up with about 400 years. Okay? So if we overlap some of those Judges, maybe we can squish that a little bit, but still, if we're going with this date of 1250, we're stretching things, okay? So there is no easy way to figure out which one of these or even another alternative is correct. If we look into the land of Egypt, we see another couple of things. So who's the Pharaoh after Ramses? I want to hear somebody pronounce it. Merneptah, okay? Merneptah. So this thing over here on the left is called the Merneptah Stela, okay? It might look small, but it's like 2 times as tall as we are, okay? And it is massive, and it is a monument to Pharaoh Merneptah. One interesting fact is Merneptah was not the firstborn son of Pharaoh Ramses. Why might that be? We know that Ramses' firstborn son from Egyptian sources died before Ramses himself died. Okay, so that's interesting. But Merneptah is his next son in line, and he became Pharaoh after him. And here on this black stela, we have the first extra-biblical, that means outside the Bible, extra-biblical mention of Israel ever. The first time Israel is ever mentioned outside of the Bible is right here in this Pharaoh who follows Ramses II. He mentions Israel in the context of saying, I defeated them. I went up into the land of Canaan and I defeated Israel. He's not so much talking about them as a nation as he is about a people group. So if Israel has just been released from slavery in Egypt, they're probably not quite solidified as a nation with a government yet, right? They're still probably in this period of the Judges. And Merneptah heads up into Canaan, and he's fighting against other Canaanite city-states, kings, and such. And Israel, whoever that is according to him, is among the people that he says he defeats. Here's what he says. Carried off is Ashkelon, that's a city near Gaza. Seized upon is Gezer, that's a city. Yanoam is made that which does not exist. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Okay, so he's pretty confident. I have laid waste to Israel. Maybe it's because Israel, I know that those are the fools that snuck out in the cover of darkness under the reign of my father, but I have conquered them. I have wiped them out. His seed does not exist anymore. Yes, sir? Victors always write history, yes. Yep. Yeah. But I do think even though he's the one writing history, it's significant that this is our first example of extra biblical example of the nation or of the name Israel that we have in history. Okay. So are we tracking any questions before we move on? You still like me? No, this is the only one other than like after King Tut, we have his general come, but King Tut didn't have a son. He was too young. But so that's the only like place that we're fairly certain that a firstborn son did not succeed his father. Okay. All right. Got about 15 minutes. Let's see where we want to go. Okay. So the other thing about an early date of Exodus that is difficult is if we take this 1450-ish, 1466 kind of date, we have a difficulty with some of the cities in the conquest. So in the book of Joshua, we know the children of Israel head into the land of Israel, and they level at least a number of cities. Some people who are like angry at God might say like God is evil and just destroyed an entire generation of people. It was genocide. If you actually read the text closely, you notice that the only cities that are actually leveled are 3 cities. Anybody know what they are? Jericho. It's a tough one. It's 2 letters. Ai. And in the north, Hatzor. So these cities, curiously, we have very little, if any, evidence that they were occupied from the time of 1500 or so up to the time of 1200. Okay? We have little evidence that there is activity, archaeological activity going on in those regions. And so that's led scholars to say, like, how could they have come out at this time and leveled those cities? Because there were no people who lived in those cities. It's a problem, right? Okay. So here on the screen is the city of Hatzor. So we have a very definitive, if you go to Israel today, this is a picture that I took of the wall inside a cultic religious area inside the city of Hatzor. We have this black line. Anybody want to guess what that black line is? Okay. So this is actually like a false line that they put in to show you, like, something happened here, tourist. Do you see that things are different? It's a little difficult to see, but we have a very different building style down here than we have above. And what do we notice about this lower building style? Say it loud. It looks different for sure. Yeah, look, so it's different material. These are like smaller bricks up here. But what about all of these cracks and the blackness on it? What causes that kind of thing in rock? Say it again. Water? Fire. Fire. Exactly. So we know the city of Hatzor was leveled, destroyed, and burned at this time. Guess when archaeologists date this destruction of Hatzor? It's around 1200. Okay? So there was a significant destruction event at one of the cities that we know Joshua and the people of Israel conquered and burned in the conquest. Okay? So that would fit very well with the later date of Exodus, not so well with the early date of Exodus. So works well with the 1250, not so well with the 1450-ish region. Let's see here. However, there are issues on both sides. Issues if we take the early date, issues if we take the late date. One thing that Tremper Longman suggests in this Exodus book, How to Read Exodus, he suggests maybe we're reading things wrong altogether. Maybe we're misunderstanding perhaps the dating. Like maybe it's not that eclipse, but this eclipse. Or the way that we're counting so concretely from that date of Jehu up to Solomon. Maybe we miscounted in that time frame. Maybe even something in the Egyptian side got skewed. Or perhaps we know that the Hyksos were a Semitic people who headed out of Egypt around 1570. And we know from Egyptian sources that they headed at least as far as Gaza. What if, along with the Hyksos people, there were a group of Hebrew people who went out with them? So the Hebrew were not the same as the Hyksos, but what if at the same time the Hyksos people were being expelled, the Hebrew people headed out of Egypt as well, around that same time frame? And there are layers of destruction throughout Israel, north of Gaza, that we've always just assumed were the Hyksos that just continued their path of destruction up throughout Canaan. But what if we read scripture and the archaeological evidence together and said, what if that were the Hebrew people that took that as an opportunity, listened to God's voice, and said, now we're going to take over this land that we know God has promised to us? It's a possibility. I don't know that it's convincing for me. We know also around the time of 1200, there's a significant influx of population in the hill country around Jerusalem, north and south of there. Okay? So there we have evidence that falls kind of on all three of these types of hypotheses, and it's up to you to decide. But is it plausible? Is it plausible? Certainly, especially when we consider that the people of Israel looked to this event and said, this is our foundation. This is where we come from. This is our event that defines who we are as a people. You have another question? Yep, certainly. That's a good point, and that's part of the difficulty of doing historical discovery. On the question of names, let me throw this out there just to throw another wrench into our discussion here. In Genesis chapter 47, is that before Ramses? This is the story of Joseph. Is that before Ramses? Genesis 47:11 says this, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of," Ramses, just as Pharaoh directed. So there's something about the way that the people of Israel or the biblical authors are writing, that they're not writing like, it's not like the event happened and I automatically have to write it down. It's somebody some years in the future, who knows how many years that is, who's looking back and trying to explain to his current people 200 years, 300, 400, 500 years later, saying, Joseph got land in this region, and this is the region you know is called Ramses. So sometimes when we're over here on history and looking back, I'm not going to use the name that was used way back then, because that's useless if it has fallen out of use. But what I can do is say, Joseph got land in the region of Ramses, knowing full well Ramses didn't come along until 400 years after Joseph. Okay? So just let that simmer for a little bit and make it even more confusing for us as we try to nail down a date. Whether that same thing is happening in Exodus chapter 1:11, we don't know, okay? And we're going to live with, we don't know, okay? We do know that this site up here, up here in the Delta area, around Goshen, you see Ramses Avaris. We do know that that pretty definitively is the city called Ramses. But that only happened during the time of Ramses. So it's quite likely if the Hebrews are building cities in that region, it's only during the actual time of Ramses. So we're going to run out of time getting to what you actually wanted to know is where in the wilderness is the mountain of God, right? You guys ready for another hour? No, here we go. So we'll talk about this just very, very briefly. If you want, I would encourage you to watch. Many of you are familiar with the Patterns of Evidence videos. I don't know that I would agree with his conclusions, but he does talk to legitimate scholars and he does present the various options fairly well. So I would encourage you, if this topic fascinates you, you're going to get more from, he's got probably close to 10 hours worth of interviews and discussions and things where he's going through, here's what it even looks like. Here's what the people were seeing as they're walking through this gorge. And as we're considering the names of some of these particular sites, one of them is the mouth of the gorge, or maybe it's canal. So he walks through some of those issues. Take his conclusions with a grain of salt, because he's not an expert archaeologist. He's a filmmaker, and he's trying to kind of come up with a hybrid approach very frequently that takes kind of the best of each of the positions and is like, well, I like that, and so it must be that. So take that with a grain of salt, but I would recommend them as a way of investigating and seeing, like, what are the real issues that are at stake here. Were you going to say something, Caitlin? No? Okay. So I would recommend those at least to watch. You can get them through Vudu service right now. You can watch them with commercials. I'm sorry it's called Vudu, but that's what it's called. And if you want to watch it for free, you can watch it there at this moment. If you have access to Right Now Media, you can also do it through that, or you can buy them. But so let's see here. Let's take a look just briefly at some of the big discussions in the next 1 minute. You got it? All right. So first of all, we have 4 primary routes through the Sinai Peninsula. So we know the people of Israel, or the Hebrews, are leaving from Ramses or Avaris. If you, Meg, could you go to the last slide? Keep going, this one here. So you have a picture of this. This is a pretty good representation of the major theories. Now, this representation probably accounts for like 5% of the major theories, but all of the other theories are some kind of variation on these lines that you see here. So we have a northern route that goes over this kind of land bridge right up here. We have a southern route. This red line is the traditional route of the Exodus, what most scholars would say is the legitimate route. And then we kind of have this middle way. So we have 3 main routes through Sinai. This way up here, right along the coast, was known as the way of the Philistines. And God said, don't go the way of the Philistines, because he knows if you go and you start getting involved in battles, and you're going to get discouraged pretty quickly and decide we want to turn back. God probably also knew that they would just get discouraged anyways and want to turn back no matter what happened. But he said, don't turn back because of the opposition you face. So because of the prominence of people coming, the Asiatic people coming from Canaan and elsewhere into the land of Egypt, Egypt set up borders here. I don't think, but they describe a wall basically of garrison sites that they set up right around here. So you see the name Migdol right here. That means garrison. And garrison is actually Migdol is one of the sites that the children of Israel are supposed to camp by, or in between Migdol and Baal-zephon, which I don't see on this particular map. So that's not, we have a lot of Egyptian loan words that sound similar in Egyptian that the Hebrew writer of Exodus employs to say, like, this is that. We don't have a word for Yam Suf, the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, but this is what the Egyptians call it, so we're going to call it Yam Suf, okay? So we're guessing on almost all of these sites. We know pretty well that Ramses, or Kantir here is the name. We know pretty well Sukkot is in the right location. Pitom is like, we're pretty okay with that. But as we go on from there to Etam. I don't even see that they put an Etam on here, or Migdol, or Baal-zephon, or any of these other options. We're guessing at best, okay? Egyptologists, Hebrew archaeologists, they're all making the best guess that they have with the data available, which is itty bitty. So the basic account goes, if you're crossing the Red Sea, the basic three understandings are: one, that it's happening very close to where they're living, that they're crossing one of these shallow lakes that is surrounded by reeds, the Reed Sea, okay? These lakes are very shallow, and some would even say if you get the right kind of wind, it says God blew an east wind overnight, and by the morning as they woke up, they saw, hey, there's land that we can cross. And that could make sense as a natural explanation for what's going on here in this lake region. You see here the red line and this purple line cross the Gulf of Suez right here at the very, very tip. I would suggest if it's one of these lakes, it would be just as easy for the Egyptian army to be like, I'm not going through that water. I'm going around the lake, and we'll catch you on the other side. Okay? So just recognize that there are difficulties with all of these. A recent popular kind of explanation is that it happened over here at Nuweiba, at the Gulf of Aqaba. So if you watch the Patterns of Evidence documentary, he definitely leans towards this Nuweiba crossing. And I kind of like the idea of it. It seems dramatic. This is where the scene, the image, would have been like stuck in the Israelites' mind more than any other option, perhaps the Gulf of Suez one. But in order to do that, they have to cross all of this land in order just to get there, okay? And they could have just as easily said, like, we're right here, we're going to go around the top of it, instead of, no, we'll detour and come down. But we know that in the text it says, God says, turn back. Make a turn that is not logical, because I want to draw Pharaoh into my trap, basically. I want Pharaoh to think these fools are wandering around in the wilderness, and I've got them, and I want to display my glory. We know that's what God does, right? So I'm not going to go too much further into it, but that, I think, is the number one thing to think through as you're reading through these narratives, as you're thinking through what, when, where, how did this happen. It's not something that God wants the people to think like, well, that was a coincidence. I mean, that was pretty helpful that just happened. Yeah, God did that. But no, they get on the other side and they dedicate a song to God of the depths of the sea is where you dragged the Egyptian army into. There were 600 chariots chasing after us. At least one of them was probably like, we could go around this lake, guys. This lake isn't that deep. These lakes that are right near where they're at, many of them are like chest deep at the deepest, okay? So we have difficulties, again, no matter which route we choose. If we're looking for Mount Sinai, the traditional site is down here in southern Sinai. We have other ones that are a little bit closer up north. We have some over here in Midian. We know Moses saw the burning bush when he was where? In Midian. So is it over across the Gulf of Aqaba? There are difficulties with every single option, but I want you to come away from it tonight saying, it's plausible. It could have happened, and because of the history of Israel and their commitment to this story, I think we can trust that it happened. We can trust that God was miraculously present with his people and giving them something amazing to remember who he is and what he has done for them. Sound good? All right, if you want to come fight me, come talk with me. But thank you so much for being with me the last couple of weeks. I hope it has been informative for you. I hope it has been, hi boys. I hope it has been enjoyable for you, that you've learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to come and chat with me now or later or over email. But God's blessings upon you. You may head out now. Thank you, and may God be with you.